We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph Meseches Shevuos. This is Shevuos Daf 46a. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing the case in the Mishnah where the Mishnah said, let's say you have a dispute between the employer and the employee whether or not the wages were paid. So the Mishnah said that the Sacher, the hired worker, is able to take a Shevuot that he was not yet paid, and then he's able to collect. And on the previous summit, Rav and Shmuel said that is only true in a situation where there's evidence that he was hired. But let's say there are no witnesses that he was hired, so then the employer can claim that he never even hired the person, and so since he can claim that, he's also believed to say that he paid the wages. And the Gemara in the previous summit was in the middle of bringing a proof. There was a brisa which has a case, again, same kind of case, where the worker takes a shvua in order to collect his wages, and the brisa contrasts that with another case. Let's say there's a dispute in terms of the amount of the wages. So over there, we say hamotzi mechaver olav haraya. There we say the worker cannot simply take a shvua in order to collect the higher amount. Rather, he has to bring evidence that he was supposed to be paid the higher amount. And so the Gemara said, well, from the fact that case in the brisa you have to bring evidence, it sounds like no evidence is needed when there's a dispute whether he was paid or not. It sounds like you do not need to have edim that he was hired by the employer, and that seems not like Rav and Shmuel. And the Gemara now continues and answers that Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, he says, no, really, Reisha v'Seifa Baraya, really, both at the beginning and the end of the brisa, there is evidence. The reason why the evidence is not mentioned in the terms of the case where the employee takes a shvua is, as the Gemara now explains, Raya de l'shalim katani. If it's a proof that is needed in order for the person to be able to get paid, so that we're going to say hamotzi mechaveiro olav haraya. We mentioned the fact that the worker needs to bring evidence that he's owed that higher amount of money, but Raya de shvua, but just a Raya that's going to lead to a shvua. The fact that he needs to bring witnesses to prove that he was hired at all in order to take a shvua, in order to collect, lo katani, that the brisa did not mention. Rashi explains, Reisha v'Seifa Baraya, the beginning and the end of the brisa, there's evidence. Meaning to say, Reisha, when it comes to the Reisha, Nihi, the Katani Nishba V'Notel, Lesa Ela Sheyavi Tchila, Edom Shescharo. Granted, it says over there, he takes a shvua to collect, but he also does need to bring witnesses that he was hired in the first place. And Raya de l'Shalim Katani, we mention in the brisa a Raya that has to do with being paid, meaning Raya HaMechayeves as Balabayas l'Shalim. If you have to bring evidence which will then obligate the Balabayas to pay, Katani, that's mentioned in the brisa. But Raya de l'Shavua, but if it's just the evidence that is brought in order to take a shvua, Sheina Bala l'Galgal as-Hashvua l'Sacher, it's a Raya that's needed for the Sacher to be able to take a shvua to collect, Lo Katani, that's not mentioned in the brisa. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba says, Shalchu leimi bei Rav l'Shmuel, they send from the yeshiva of Rav to Shmuel, Yilamdeinu Rabbeinu, teach us our Rebbe, Uman Omer Shtayim Katzatzali, let's say the craftsman, the worker says that you're supposed to pay me two, V'al Omer lo Katzatzli loch el achas, and the employer says I was only going to pay you one. So mi nishba, who takes a shvu, who takes the oath in that situation? Amar Elheni said to them, Bazu, in this case, Yishava balabayis, the employer should take an oath, V'yafsid uman, and then the worker will lose out. And the idea over here is that the employer will take a shvua that he owes the lesser amount, and that's what he will pay. And the Gemara continues, Ktsitza vaday midkar dachirianshi. The reason is because when it comes to the amount of wages that were set, that certainly the person does remember, and so therefore we assume that the balabayas, we assume the employer knows how much it is, so he simply takes the shvua and he pays that lesser amount. But the Gemara continues and asks, Ini, is this really the case? V'atani Rav bar Shmuel, but Rav bar Shmuel taught Katzatz that in the situation of where there's a dispute of how much the person should be paid, Hamotzi mechaver olav haraya, that the ruling is Hamotzi mechaver olav haraya, which means to say that the employee, the worker, has to bring evidence of how much he's supposed to get paid, otherwise he collects the lesser amount. V'lo ma'asiraya, it sounds like it's saying if he doesn't bring evidence, so pakasa, then he loses out. And so therefore the question is, Amai, why is that the case? Yishava balabayis v'yafsidum, and what should happen is that the balabayis then has to take a shvua, and only then should the worker lose out. And the Gemara continues and answers, in fact, that is the case. Amar Rav Nachman says, Litzdad in Katani. The way you have to understand this teaching, the way you have to understand this ruling is we're telling you two parts of the ruling as separate components of the ruling. Meaning the idea is as follows. O maybe raya v'yitol, either the worker brings evidence and then he'll be able to collect, and if he's not able to do that, o yishava balabayis v'yafsid uman, so then the balabayis will take a shvua and the uman will lose out. And the Gemara continues, Meisve, we have a question from the following Braisa, Hanosen taliso lu'uman, let's say a person gives his cloak to the uman, to the craftsman, uman omer kotzatz lishtayim, the uman says that the amount of wages that we set is 2, you're going to pay me 2 dinar, v'halomer lo kotzatzti lachalachas, and the employer says, no, I was only going to give you 1. So the halach is as follows, Kolzman shetalis biyad uman, as long as the uman is holding the talis, al balabayis lahavi raya, so it's really the burden is on the balabayis, on the employer to bring evidence, otherwise he has to pay the higher amount. Nosna lo, now if the uman gives the talis of the balabayis, so bismano, so in the proper time, nishba v'notel, actually the employee, the worker can take the oath in order to collect the higher amount, but avar zmano, but if the time to be paid has passed, then hamotzi mechaver olavaraya, then already the worker needs to bring evidence if he wants to get paid the higher amount. And so the Gemara asks, Bismano mia, what does it say? Nevertheless, in this brisa it says that in the proper time, nishba v'notel, that the worker, the employee, is able to take the oath in order to collect the higher amount. And that's a question on what we just said from Shmuel Amai. Why is that true? Yishava balabayis, what should happen is the balabayis is the one who should take the oath, v'yafsid uman, and then the worker, the craftsman, should lose out. And Rashi explains, Kolzman shatalis biyad uman, as long as the talis is in the hands of the uman. The balhabayis have a motzi mechavero. At that point in time, the balhabayis is the one that's being motzi from his friend. He's trying to take it out of the possession of the uman. All of haraya, so it's upon him to bring evidence. L'havi edem shelo katzatz ala achas. He has to bring witnesses that he only set the lower amount of wages. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Moni, who is the author of this brisa? It is true that in this brisa, it says that it is the worker who takes the oath, and that seems to go against the ruling of Shmuel, but this brisa is actually following the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. It's actually following the opinion of the Tana Rabbi Yehuda. The Amar, because Rabbi Yehuda says, Kolzman sheshvua nota eitz al balabayis, anytime the shvua really fundamentally should be by the balabayis, like in this case, the balabayis is being modev and mixas, so he really is the one who should be taking the shvua. Says Rabbi Yehuda, Sacher nishba v'notel. It's actually the Sacher who takes the shvua and he collects. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Yehuda, follows Rabbi Yehuda, v'hachanami, here also, shvua eitz al balabayis hi min Torah. On a Torah level, the shvua really is by the employer, it's by the balabayis, sharei modeh b'mixas, because he's a modeh b'mixas. And so again, following the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, in such a situation, the hired worker is the one that takes the shvua. And the Gemara continues and asks, hey Rabbi Yehuda, which Rabbi Yehuda are we referring to when we say the brisa is Rabbi Yehuda, that the worker has the upper hand, that again, let's say there's a dispute in terms of how much the worker should be paid, the worker can simply take a shvu and get paid the higher amount. Where do we find that Rabbi Yehuda gives the worker the upper hand? Ilema Rabbi Yehuda demas nisan. If you're going to say it's Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, now in the Mishnah's case there was a dispute whether the worker had been paid at all. Again, the Mishnah was talking about a situation where the worker says he was not yet paid, the Balabayis says that he did pay the worker, and so we said that since the Balabayis is very busy with all of his workers, he might not remember, and therefore we actually allow the worker to take the shvua and he can collect. But Rabbi Yehuda over there says we don't do that in all situations, only in a situation where the balabayis is a mode of a mixas, he admits partially, so in that situation we'll say that since there really should be a shvua and it should be with the balabayis, we put the shvua onto the worker. But the Gemara says, achmure kamachmer, but over there, Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, he's actually more strict than the Tanakama, so we can't be bringing from Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, because the whole point over here is we want to find a Rabbi Yehuda that's more lenient when it comes to the worker. Rashi explains, achmure machmer, Rabbi Yehuda there is stricter, al hasacher, he's stricter on the worker, mishkal shvua minei, because he takes the shvua away from the worker. Let's say it's a situation where it is not a mode of a mixas of the balabayis, but it's a kofar bakol. He actually takes the shvua away from the worker, v'shadyu al balabayis, and he gives the shvua to the balabayis, so it cannot be Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. As the Gemara continues, the Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Ad shetehei sham mixas hodah. Only when there's a partial admission on behalf of the Balabayis, then we say that the Shavuot goes to the worker, and again, Rabbi Yehuda is the stricter opinion. And so the Gemara instead says, El Rabbi Yehuda de Braisa, rather the Rabbi Yehuda we're referring to is the Rabbi Yehuda of the following Braisa. The Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa, Socher, when it comes to a hired worker, calls man shalo over all of zmano, as long as the time to pay has not passed, harei zen nishba v'notel. He takes an oath and he's able to collect. V'imla, but if not, eino nishba v'notel. He's not able to take a shvuah and collect. V'amar Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda says, Eimosai, when is that true? Bizman she'amar lo tainli sechari chamishim dinar sheyeshli biyodcha. Let's say he says, give me my wages, the 50 dinar that you have of mine. V'hu omer, and then he says back, hiskabalta mehen dinar zav. You actually did already receive a dinar zav, that is 25 dinar of kesef. So he essentially admits to part of it. Osha amar lo, or he says to him, shtayim katzatzta. Let's say it's a dispute in terms of the amount that he should be paid. He says, I should be paid too. V'halo omer lo katzatzti lo chelachas, and he says, no, I was only going to pay you one. That's when we say, again, it's in those situations that we say the sacher can take a shvuah and collect. Aval amar lo, but let's say the balabayis says to the worker, lo sachartich me'olam, I never hired you at all. Osha amar lo, or let's say he says to him, sachartich, I did hire you. V'nasati loch scharech, and I gave you all of your wages. So then we say, hamotzi mechaver all of araya. In that case we say, if you're trying to be motzi, if one party is trying to be motzi from the other, he has to bring evidence. And the point over here is that we do see in Rabbi Yehuda exactly the case in the brisa above, in a situation where there's a dispute, where he says that you were going to pay me two, the worker says you were going to pay me two, and the balabai says I was only going to pay you one. So it says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, in this situation, that the worker is able to take a shvuah in order to collect. That's exactly what the brisa said above. And again, the point over here is, that is not going to be like Shmuel. Shmuel held that in such a situation, it's the balabayis who takes the shvuah. But the Gemara continues and asks, Maskif lo Rav Shisha b'rei Ravidi, Rav Shisha b'rei Ravidi, he asks as follows, Elakotzatz Rav Yehuda hi v'lo Rabbanan, but then what are we suggesting? We're saying that in this dispute by Kotzatz, meaning again in a dispute in terms of how much the person was supposed to be paid, that's Rav Yehuda and not the Rabbanan. We're suggesting now that Rav Yehuda would say that the worker has the upper hand, but the Rabbanan would not give the worker the upper hand. They apparently would go like Shmuel, but that doesn't make sense. Hashta now, Hechi demachmir Rav Yehuda, in situations where Rabbi Yehuda was strict, Mikila Rabbanan, we saw above that the Rabbanan were generally more lenient than Rabbi Yehuda. So Heicha Demekel Rabbi Yehuda, so now in a situation where Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient on behalf of the worker, Machmeri Rabbanan, then you're saying that the Rabbanan are going to be more strict. And Rashi explains, are we now suggesting that by kotzatz, again, when there's a dispute in terms of how much the worker should be paid, and we're saying the worker gets the upper hand, that's Rabbi Yehuda and not the Rabbanan? Bitmiya, the Gemara is asking this as a question. That which we're saying, that again, in the case of ktsitza, the socher is able to swear, the worker is able to swear, and we're saying that leniency on behalf of the worker is Rabbi Yehuda, Kamarla, that's Rabbi Yehuda saying that, velo Rabbanan and not the Rabbanan. So now, Hechud de Machmir Rabbi Yehuda, in a situation where Rabbi Yehuda was Machmir Asacher, he was Machmir on the worker, and where did we say that? We said that just above. Kagon b'she'ein mixas hoda etzel balabayis. We said in situations where the balabayis does not partially admit. So in those situations, Rabbi Yehuda is actually strict. Rabbi Yehuda says even though normally we allow the Sacher to take a shvuah in order to collect, let's say there's a dispute whether he was paid or not, that's only in situations where the balabayis is moed b'mixas. But in cases where the balabayis is not modem and mixas, we don't allow the sacher to do that. And so therefore, in such a situation, Mekil and Rabbanan, again, in a situation where the Balabayis is not modem and mixas, the Rabbanan are actually lenient. They still allow the sacher to take a shavua that he wasn't yet paid. Mekil and Rabbanan sacher, the Rabbanan are mekel on the sacher in that case. They knew b'shavua and they believe him in a shavua. So wouldn't it make sense that the Rabbanan would also be lenient when it comes to ketzitza? If you're suggesting that Rabbi Yehuda by ketzitza is lenient on the sacher, that's fine. But the Rabbanan should be even more lenient than Rabbi Yehuda in that regard. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'yala mai Rabbanan, but what's the alternative to say that over here by Ktsitza, it's really following the Rabbanan who are more lenient than Rabbi Yehuda? V'yala hadatani Rava bar Shmuel, but then that which Rava bar Shmuel taught, that kotzatz, that by the case of kotzatz, again where there's a dispute in terms of how much the worker should be paid, hamotzi mechaveru olav haraya, so we say hamotzi mechaveru olav haraya, and the worker does not have the upper hand. So who's that going to be? Lo Rabbi Yehuda v'lo Rabbanan. It's not going to be Rabbi Yehuda or the Rabbanan. And the reason, of course, why it can't be Rabbi Yehuda either is because we just quoted in the brisa above that Rabbi Yehuda is lenient with the worker in such a situation. And so the Gemara instead says, Elam Rava, rather Rava says, B'haka miflgi. What's actually going on is as follows. Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan are arguing in the following. Rabbi Yehuda holds b'doraisa, that when we have a shvuah doraisa, Avdu le takanta l'sacher. So then we make a takana on behalf of the sacher. In other words, if you have a situation, let's say there is a dispute whether the sacher has been paid at all, and the balabayis is moed b'mixas, so really the balabayis technically should be taking a shvua, but we say the balabayis doesn't really know, he's very busy with all of his workers, he doesn't really know whether he paid, and therefore we make a takana on behalf of the worker, we allow him to take the shvua. Uvidrabanan, but in a situation of a drabanan, meaning to say, let's say it's a situation where the balabayis is a kofer bakol, he is not moed b'mixas, and again it's a dispute whether or not the sacher has been paid, so there have it takanta by a drabanan already, so even initially it's just a takana, the concept of shvua, but takanta la takanta lo avdina, we're not going to do a takana on a takana, and so in that situation where really there is no shvua even upon the balabayis in the first place, we're not going to just allow the sacher in that case to take a shvua, we're going to say hamotzi mechaveru olav haraya in that situation. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. V'Rabbanan Savri, now the Rabbanan hold, b'Rabbanan nami avdinan takanta l'sacher. No, by the Rabbanans as well, we make the exact same takana on behalf of the worker, and we say even in that situation of kofer bakol, if there's a dispute if he's been paid or not, we say that the worker is still allowed to take a shvu in order to collect. However, the Rabbanan say you ketzitza, but when it comes to ketzitza, it actually reverses, because midkar docher, because by ketzitza specifically, the Rabbanan say that yes, actually the balabayis does remember, he knows exactly what he was supposed to pay, and so therefore in that particular situation, the Rabbanan are actually stricter than Rabbi Yehuda, and they do not give the worker that leniency. And Rashi explains, Ella b'ha pligi, rather the machlokas is as follows. Uliolam, the point over here, the answer is that really katzatz Rabbi Yehuda v'lo Rabbanan, that in a situation of katzatz, it's Rabbi Yehuda who's lenient with the worker and not the Rabbanan. V'hadatani Rava bar Shmuel Rabbanan, and the brisa that Rava bar Shmuel taught, where we're stricter with the worker, that follows the Rabbanan. Udekash aloch, and that which was bothering you, hashta hecha de machmir Rabbi Yehuda, that how could it be that Rabbi Yehuda is more machmir in the Mishnah, and now all of a sudden we're saying he's more lenient in this case? Yes, it actually does happen that way. In one case, Rabbi Yehuda is stricter. In the other case, Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient. Uvaha pligi, and they argue as follows. Rabbi Yehuda savar b'doraisa. Rabbi Yehuda holds that in situations of doraisa, avdu rabbanan takanta l'sacher, any situation of a doraisa, we make a takana on behalf of the worker. Hecha di'ika bal habayis shvua doraisa, meaning if it's a situation where the balabayis would technically be taking a shvu on a doraisa level because he's moed b'mixas, avdu rabbanan takana l'sacher, the rabbanan make a takana to help the worker, lemivche l'shvua, they give him the right to take the shvua and he can collect. Aval rabbanan takana, but when it comes to a situation where the shvua in the first place would only be the rabbanan, again let's say kofer bakol, the takanta lo avdin, we don't do a takana on a takana, hecha de'ein sham moda, hecha de'ein sham mixas hoda, if there's no partial hoda, to lo ramya balabayis el Shavuos heses derabanan, he, if all that would have been on the balabayis is a Shavuos heses derabanan, so again he gufa takanta, he that itself is a takana Rav Nachman, like Rav Nachman, v'takanta l'takanta lahafcham balabayis or lemishti asacher, to make a double takana to say that it goes from the balabayis to the sacher, lo av rabbanan, that we do not do, and so therefore essentially across the board, Rabbi Yehuda says that in a situation of modim and mixas, we can be lenient and give the shvua to the sacher, but we're not going to do that in a situation where you don't have the modim and mixas, you don't have the shvua d'oraisa. However, uktzisa midkar dechiri inchi. Now, when it comes to the rabbanan say that's not how we view it, because in situations of ketzitza, we actually are going to be strict because we say people remember, meaning svira lehu l'rabbanan de pligi ad Rabbi Yehuda. That's what the rabbanan hold who argue on Rabbi Yehuda. Hilka chachmiru ba gabe sacher. Therefore, specifically by ketzitza, actually the rabbanan are more machmir against the worker. They're more machmir than Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara continues with the two dots. The Mishnah said, Nigzal Ketzad, what's the case of Nigzal, where we say a person takes a shvu in order to collect. And the Mishnah said, Hayum idino sosha nichnas leveso lemashchan v'chulu. Let's say they testify about a certain person, that he went to take a collateral from a person's house that he wasn't supposed to take. He says that he never took it. The other person says he did take it. So in that case, again, the claimant is able to take a shvua in order to collect what he claims was taken from him. And the Gemara says, V'dilma lo mishchano, but maybe the person didn't actually take anything. Milo Amar of Nachman, dinner of Nachman say, Haiman denokin narga biyade. Let's say a person's holding an axe in his hand. V'amar, he says, Ezel ve'ektele ledikla deplanya. He announces that he's going to cut down the palm tree of so-and-so. Ve'shtakach de katel v'shadim. We find that it in fact was cut down. Lo amrinan dehu katli. We don't assume that this person is the one that cut it down. It's essentially circumstantial evidence. Alma of it inish de gazim v'lo of it. We see that sometimes the person, he'll exaggerate, but he's not actually going to follow through. So hachanami de gazim v'lo of it. So here also, just because they testify he entered the house in order to take something, but maybe he's exaggerating. He didn't actually do anything. Why should we say in this situation that the nigzal is just able to take a shvua and collect? And the Gemara says, Emo mishchano. No, what we should say is that the witnesses actually did see that he took something. But the Gemara says, 1 second, if the witnesses saw him take something, v'lichsi my mishchano, so why not just let us see what they should say what he took? Let them see what he took, and then you don't need a shvu at all. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabba bar Rachan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabba bar Rachan says, the Rabbi Yochanan says, Betoa no kelim hanitolin tachas kanaf, of the claim over here is he took things that could be hidden, there's small things that could be hidden under his garments, and that's why the shvua is needed. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yehuda says, Ro shehit min kelim tachas kanaf of v'yotza. Let's say they see a person, again, he hides vessels underneath his garments and he goes out. And Rashi explains, V'lichsi my mashchano, why not just see what he took? Osam sheyoidu shamashchano, those who are testifying, yoidu ma mashchano ma shvua yesh. They should just testify what was taken, you don't even need a shvua. And the Gemara answered, Betoa no kelim hanitolin tachas kanaf, of the claim is that it was taken in garments, it was taken underneath his garments. Balabayis toin shenot al kelim ketanim, the Balabayis is claiming that this person took these small vessels, sh'adam yochol lahastir tachas kanfei begadav, that a person can hide underneath his garments, v'lo hikiru b'hamedim, and the witnesses weren't able to see that. That's the claim over here, that's what the nigzal is claiming, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Memvav Amid Beis.